serious violations of habeas corpus. You know, after 9/11, Bush rounded up thousands of Americans, many of them Muslim Americans, Arab Americans, and they were thrown in jail without charges. They didn't have lawyers. Some of them were pretty mistreated in New York City. And they were all released eventually.
Correct.
What is that what you mean also about throwing people in jail without charges, violating habeas corpus?
That is so obviously a violation of the natural law, the natural right to be brought before a neutral arbiter within moments of the government taking your freedom away from you. And the Constitution itself, as the Supreme Court in the Boumediene case pretty much said, wherever the government goes, the Constitution goes with it, and wherever the Constitution goes are the rights that the Constitution has to guarantee, and habeas corpus cannot be suspended by the president ever. It can only be suspended by the Congress in times of rebellion, which In re Milligan says, meaning rebellion of such magnitude that judges can't get into their courthouses. That has not happened in American history. So what President Bush did with the suspension of habeas corpus, with the whole concept of Guantanamo Bay, with the whole idea that he could avoid and evade federal laws, treaties, federal judges, and the Constitution, was blatantly unconstitutional and in some cases criminal.
What's the sanction for President Bush?
Unfortunately,
and Vice President
there has
Cheney?
been no sanction except what history will say about them.
What should be the sanction?
They should have been indicted. They absolutely should have been indicted for torturing, for spying, for arresting without warrant. I'd like to say they should be indicted for lying, but believe it or not, unless you're under oath, lying is not a crime, at least not an indictable crime. It's a moral crime.
So you think George W. Bush and Dick Cheney should, even though they've left office, they haven't escaped the criminal laws, they should be indicted and prosecuted?
The evidence in this book and in others, our colleague, the great Vincent Bugliosi, has amassed an incredible amount of evidence. The purpose of this book was not to amass that evidence, but I do discuss it. Is overwhelming when you compare it to the level of evidence required for a normal indictment. That George W. Bush, as president, and Dick Cheney, as vice president, participated in criminal conspiracies to violate the federal law and the guaranteed civil liberties of hundreds, maybe thousands of human beings.
Is Obama still supervising torture?
As far as I know, yes. As far as I know, people are still undergoing rendition. We still have some of these black prisons, they call them. I don't know why that phrase is, but the intelligence community refers to it because they like to deny that it exists, like a black hole. And we still have people in Guantanamo Bay who are being kept without charge, without trial, and the president still claims the power to lock people up and throw away the key. Recently, this president claimed the power through his then Director of National Intelligence, Admiral Blair, who has since resigned, though I'm not sure he's left office yet, to kill Americans on foreign soil if the president thinks that they are engaged in acts of terrorism. That would be murder.
In other words, the president, contrary to our separation of powers, the president becomes the prosecutor, the judge, the jury, and the executor.
In his own mind, yes. And what torments me, Ralph, is that there was no outrage when Admiral Blair said that. I don't know if President Bush did that, and I don't hold water for President Bush, but if he had said that, or if Admiral Hayden, President Bush's Director of National Security, had said that while President Bush was in office, our friends in the media would have gone over the top about it, and rightly so. Why did they not do so when President Obama's Director of National Security said that? Why do we believe that as we're sitting in a comfortable studio in Washington, D.C., somebody not far from here is pressing a button on a computer which dispatches a plastic drone to somewhere in Pakistan to kill an American? If the government believes an American committed a crime, arrest him, indict him, and follow due process. That's what the Constitution says.
Well, lie number 15 is we don't torture, which we've been talking about. And at the beginning, you say, on June 26, 2003, President George W. Bush asserted, quote, the United States is committed to a worldwide elimination of torture, and we're leading this fight by example, end quote. You continue, no surprise here, President Bush lied. The United States of America is not committed to the worldwide elimination of torture. Rather, under Bush, it supported, facilitated, and directly engaged in torture. The United States has tortured people and will continue to torture so long as Americans overlook and excuse the crimes committed by our government and as long as Americans accept government deception on torture. Now, you say that torture violates U.S. law, like
Correct.
the War Crimes Act of 1996, which was
Correct.
passed under Clinton. It violates the U.S. Army Manual. It violates the U.S. Constitution. It violates the Geneva Convention. Where are the 1 million lawyers in this country, only a tiny number of which, including you, have spoken out? Aren't they supposed to be the sentinels for the rule of law,
they
for
are.
probable cause, for due process?
They are.
How do you explain that?
I don't understand the reticence of lawyers to stand up for the rights of the innocent unless it's, forgive me for saying this, racial, because the innocents all happen to be young males, or for the most part in their 20s with dark skin. I hope that that's not the case, but it's the only rational conclusion that one can come to. Lawyers should be shouting from the rooftops. They should be filing lawsuit after lawsuit. They should be seeking indictment after indictment. If there's any line that could be drawn in the sand, it is that we don't torture. I believe it doesn't work. There's a lot of evidence in there that it doesn't work. Even if it does work, it is the most contrary thing to our values and our standards one could imagine. We simply don't do it. In this, I argue that George Bush made arguments that he didn't do it, but in fact did. And I quote a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, Susan Crawford, who simply said, we tortured. We did, no matter what the president said.
That's right. It's right on
The evidence is overwhelming. Now Federal Judge Bybee, when he was Assistant Attorney General Bybee, wrote a horrific memorandum to the president telling him what he could get away with and what he couldn't. In the memorandum itself, he contradicts himself and admits that these techniques are a near occasion of death, which is one of the definitions of an act of torture.
Would you prosecute him, and would you prosecute John Yoo, who was his collaborator in the memos, the notorious memos justifying these war crimes?
Without question, I would. Unfortunately, the Justice Department, the present Justice Department, President Obama's Justice Department, has just issued some sort of a whitewash that these guys were just lawyers giving advice. There's a certain point beyond which a lawyer knows she or he cannot go when giving advice, especially when the entity to which you're giving advice has all the power and might of the President of the United States. They advised him to commit crimes. That advice is criminal.
And you say in your book, Mr. President and Attorney General Holder, what are you waiting for? And you're referring to President Obama.
I am, and I would ask him that if I had the opportunity. A lawyer who taught constitutional
programs.